Guns are in the news and nobody's happy about it. First son Hunter Biden has been indicted on gun charges. Probably more significantly, the governor of New Mexico has reacted to gun violence in her state by suspending Second Amendment rights in Albuquerque and surrounding areas. Can she do that? Let's find out in today's discussion on Independent Outlook. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try to bring you an independent take on the issues of the day, keeping an eye on the fate of liberty. As always, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Williamson Evers, who's the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Graham.
Great to see you. Also, I'm very pleased to have us joined today by our featured expert and our colleague, Stephen Halbrook. Steve Halbrook is a senior fellow with the Independent Institute, also a practicing attorney, and most notably, an author of many important books on the Second Amendment, including most recently this new book, The Right to Bear Arms, very much worth getting. Other books like Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France, Gun Control in the Third Reich, the Founders' Second Amendment. And if I'm not mistaken, Steve, you have won gun cases yourself before the Supreme Court and have been cited by the court. Is that right?
That's correct, Graham. Good to be with you, long-term colleagues. Thank you for having me. I'm sure we'll have a great discussion today.
Much appreciated. So let's go to New Mexico. So apparently last week there was an 11-year-old boy named Froilan Villegas who was killed and his aunt critically wounded when they were leaving a minor league baseball game. And that was one of a succession of shootings in New Mexico. And so the governor of New Mexico decided that she had it. So first, last Thursday, she declared a statewide public health emergency because of gun violence. And then on Friday, she said she was suspending the right to carry, open or concealed, in Albuquerque and some surrounding areas. So can she do that, Steve Halbrook?
She thought she could do it, but nobody agrees with her in the state of New Mexico. First of all, we had law enforcement officials saying they're not going to enforce it. Then we had the Attorney General, Raul Torres, write her a long letter explaining that there's a Second Amendment and there's the Supreme Court case in Bruin. And not only is there a Second Amendment, but the New Mexico Constitution itself protects the right to bear arms for defense and security, for lawful hunting and other lawful purposes. You can't just wipe all of this out. So the Attorney General said, Governor, I'm not going to defend you in court because about 5 lawsuits.
Her own Attorney General.
Pardon?
Her own Attorney General.
Oh yeah. He's a Democrat. That doesn't make any difference. Look, in New Mexico, a lot of Democrats are pro-Second Amendment. Don't kid yourself. When Bill Richardson was governor, he was a very strong advocate of the right to bear arms. And under his leadership, the concealed carry permitting system was revised and made better. And so basically nobody agreed with the governor. The sheriffs said, we're not going to enforce this. And so the case ended up very quickly in court. And almost as quickly we had a temporary restraining order issued by the judge who was appointed last year by President Biden. And the judge outlines in his opinion how, look, this is a no-brainer. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. The Supreme Court held last year in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin that the right to bear arms includes the right to carry firearms on the person. And yet the governor said this was under the guise of a public health measure like you use for COVID or something, and we've seen what that leads to. And she's trying to leapfrog on that kind of emergency law, public health emergency law, to decree a gun ban, and you just can't do that.
She said apparently at one point, she said, gun violence is an epidemic in America, and I'm done letting it be an epidemic anywhere in my state. Enough is enough. So the epidemiology is now the new template for this kind of thing.
It's an attempt to use the vocabulary from public health, which the anti-gun movement has been doing for some time now, and to say that gun violence is a public health problem. It's an epidemic. But I can tell you, the person who shot that boy recently, and the other people committing acts of violence with firearms in Albuquerque and in that main county that has the population amount, the numbers that the order makes it supposedly valid in, they're not people with concealed carry permits. They're not law-abiding citizens. And no matter what you do, no matter what you decree, it has no effect whatever on criminals. And the Attorney General said that in her Dear John letter to the governor, and the court said it also. The Constitution protects this right. The court held that for a TRO, you have to show you're likely to prevail in the case on the merits, and the court readily
TRO, temporary restraining order. Okay.
Steve, were you surprised that this is able to get resolved so quickly? I noticed that Jonathan Turley was worried that since it was only going to be for 30 days, that the courts might not be able to get to it that fast.
Well, that goes into irreparable harm, which is also required for a temporary restraining order. And the violation of a constitutional right, even for a day or a short period, is irreparable harm. And that's what the court found. You also balance the equities and you look at the public interest. And the court said it's always in the public interest to enforce the Constitution.
Right.
And so this stuff about gun violence and, the sky's falling, none of that has anything to do with reality. It doesn't have anything to do with the Constitution, which protects this right. And it certainly has nothing to do with trying to repress violent acts by criminals in Albuquerque.
So you mentioned the COVID time period and emergencies that governors declared and how they went overboard in terms of personal liberties. But isn't this whole part of a larger problem, even not just in the gun area, and not just in the health area, but there are so many emergencies that presidents have declared and the governors have declared in the United States, where instead of the regular legal procedures, they hope to get around them or skirt them in one way or another.
That's right, Bill. And it depends on how much the courts are willing to stand up and enforce the Constitution. Harry Truman tried to seize the steel mills back in the Korean War, and the Supreme Court very quickly enjoined that, issued an injunction against that. We've seen Second Amendment rights were basically ignored for many decades, and finally the Supreme Court stepped in. And once the Supreme Court said, we really mean it, in the third major case, first we had Heller, then we had McDonald, then we have Bruin, by that point, it's like, we really mean it. And courts are very much so enforcing the Second Amendment more than ever before. A letter was written recently by members of Congress to Attorney General Merrick Garland saying, well, you're supposed to be enforcing civil rights. What are you doing about New Mexico? I mean, here you have a governor trying to flaunt the Constitution, and you're taking what action, Mr. Attorney General?
Okay, so maybe we should move to Hunter Biden.
Well, before we do, apparently the reaction was so swift, but she hasn't admitted wrongdoing. I mean, I guess she's not going to thwart the court rulings, but I'm not sure that she's acknowledged the facts that even her fellow Democrats in New Mexico have presented to her so clearly. Have I missed something, or is she still kind of defiant in her position at least?
Look, she's defiant. She was represented in court, not by the Attorney General, but the attorney representing her in court basically just talked about, policy dictates that we take action. That attorney somewhat disagreed with the Supreme Court. The attorney went on and on about we have to do something, And
does
of course,
she have to
what
pay,
they
since she's not defended by the Attorney General, does she have to pay for that out of the governor's accounts?
I don't know the details. This has all happened so fast.
I know.
I don't think they filed a brief. I don't think the defendant, the governor's attorney, filed a brief even. But
it was too fast.
The attorney went into court and made that argument. It's basically policy, not constitutional law.
I don't think, Graham, and to reinforce what Steve's saying, the commentator from Heritage Foundation, Swearington, I think her name is, said that she's worried that this governor will just keep spending money trying to defend us. And so I think even though it seems like it's over, it's not necessarily.
I checked the headlines this morning on the Babylon Bee, and I loved their headline. Said that the governor of New Mexico is suspending the First Amendment to stop criticism of her suspending the Second Amendment.
That's great.
Very good. Very clever.
It's probably true.
Okay, so I think maybe our liberties are a little more secure after this episode, a little paradoxically speaking. At least I hope that's the case. So let's turn the page. What's this deal with Hunter Biden? He had some kind of a plea deal, and I thought he was going to get away with whatever he was getting away with on his guns, but apparently not. Do you know the details, either of you?
Well, look, it's none too soon. Had the the prosecutor waited less than a month, the statute of limitations would have run on this case. There's a 5-year statute of limitations for Gun Control Act violations, and it expires, I think, October 12th.
Ooh.
So we were right up to the deadline.
Yeah.
Now, Hunter Biden has been indicted on 3 counts. 2 of them are somewhat redundant, but they are separate. So count 1 is a violation of a provision of the Gun Control Act, making it unlawful to make false statements to a gun dealer in a manner that is likely to mislead the dealer. And of course, what he did was to fill out the Form 4473 that you fill out when you buy a gun from a dealer, and you say, I'm not a convicted felon, I'm not an unlawful user of controlled substances, and I'm not addicted to controlled substances. You make all these representations, and then you sign it under penalty of law. So Hunter was indicted for that count, and then there's a separate false statement count that he was indicted for, that it's more of you have to knowingly make the false statements. I mean, that kind of goes along with it being a false statement, doesn't it? But knowingly is an element of the offense. And it's also based on the same misrepresentations that he made on the Form 4473, saying that I'm not an illegal user of controlled substances. So that first count is a 10-year offense. He could get 10 years incarceration. The second one is a 5-year offense, the second false statement count. And then count 3 is the fact that he possessed a firearm between the dates that he bought it, and it must have gone in the garbage can about 2 or 3 weeks later, because that's when they say that was the period of possession. First starting the date that it was acquired and then ending 2 or 3 weeks later. And so for that, if you are indeed an unlawful user of controlled substances and you possess a firearm, there's a federal jurisdictional hook there that the firearm had to be transported across state lines. So it was a Colt Cobra, which would have been made in Hartford, Connecticut. And so by being shipped to Delaware, you get federal jurisdiction there. So
I was wondering how that worked.
You have the indictment.
Mm-hmm. So
some of us are against this expansive interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause since the New Deal. Some of us.
Indeed. But, you can't help wondering, this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, Steve, but one can't help wondering, well, does the fact that Hunter Biden could get these guns so easily and so forth, does this show that we need even tougher gun control laws?
Well, no. In fact, he's being brought to justice, and in fact, he would have been brought to justice a long time ago had he been an ordinary person. People find out. I mean, look, we have constitutional rights, and you have to obviously take that into account when you pass laws. And in this case, he violated the law. There's questions about whether the law itself is constitutional, not only on the basis of it's his possession of a firearm. He's not involved in interstate commerce, and so what Bill said a minute ago about the expansive nature of the supposed commerce clause, that's an issue. And then, of course, the Second Amendment is an issue. Under the Bruin decision from last year, the Supreme Court said that the right to bear arms is presumptively available to a person, and it's the burden of a government, if they restrict that right, to show that there's a historical basis from the time of the founding or the period thereafter that exhibited the public understanding of the right, so that if you can't find historical antecedents of the kind of law that you have today, then the law that you have today might not pass constitutional muster. And in fact, there were no laws at the time of the founding prohibiting gun possession by a person who either used drugs or intoxicating beverages. You can certainly make a case that there's historical analogs for if you're intoxicated and you have a gun and you're carrying it around in public, that kind of law would be held valid, I'm certain. And the same with if you were currently using drugs and you have a gun and thereby endangering other people. But there have been some court decisions about Second Amendment rights, and that right is violated by this. The Supreme Court's going to decide a new case, the Rahimi case. It's going to hear argument in November the 7th, and it's another big Second Amendment case about these prohibited categories, and we'll see what the court does. A lot of courts are going to be waiting and seeing what the Supreme Court does in that case as to these other issues.
So, Steve, I wonder if the courts might distinguish, or you might distinguish, between a person who drinks alcohol, whether it's in 1790 or today, but is carrying a gun when he's not or she's not intoxicated, and a person who uses marijuana or uses cocaine sometimes, but is carrying a gun when they're not high, when they're not impaired, but they used it a week ago, a month ago, whatever, and does the signing that I'm not a habitual user of controlled substances, or I'm not, could debate all day what the word addicted means. Perhaps the form is violating their Second Amendment rights by not separating out the occasional user from the chronically impaired user.
Yeah, and you've got two issues, though. Possessing the firearm, indicting the person for mere possession, while being a user but not currently using, versus the other laws, the two false statement laws that are at issue here. Can you sustain a conviction, even if the Second Amendment threw out the law about possession? You've still made false statements to the government. And there again, that's going to be another issue. And the whole thing's going to be very interesting. Here you've got Joe Biden wanting to incarcerate law-abiding citizens.
He wants all these things that his son is going to be arguing against in court. He wants them to be tougher than they are.
He wants to incarcerate law-abiding people who are not addicted to anything, who are not felons, who have not made any false statements. He wants all of us to be incarcerated. But his son, what a model. He said his son didn't do anything wrong, though. So if you believe that, then I got a bridge to sell you.
The most important thing you said, Steve, a few minutes ago, I think, was your point that where the Constitution affirms that we have rights, we presumptively can be free to exercise those rights. So unless, there's some major reason that the government can show why we shouldn't, because we're a danger or somehow already used them irresponsibly maybe, but the presumption of rights is very important. I'm glad that my right to freedom of speech or free exercise of religion is my presumptive right, and you can't just legislate it away. And it turns out that the Second Amendment confers a right, or affirms a right, I should say, which is in the same category. It's a constitutional right, and it's presumptively ours as citizens.
That's right. And it was not until last year the Supreme Court finally put its step down that we had one court after another saying, okay, it's the text says you have a right to keep and bear arms, but we're going to do this balancing test. It's called mean-to-end scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and the government interest always prevails over the constitutional right. And what Justice Thomas said in the Bruin opinion, that's one step too many. You look at the text of the Constitution, and then you look for any historical analogs, laws that were similar to the one that you're dealing with that existed in 1791 when the Second Amendment was ratified. And you don't go to that additional step where you balance the right away. We don't do that anymore. We never did it in First Amendment cases. And it was a doctrine invented after Heller was decided to try to whittle away at Second Amendment rights because the courts were revolting at the decision in Heller. But here you've got some courts resisting Bruin, but you've got a lot of compliance by many courts, I think, with the Bruin decision. And the New Mexico TRO that we just talked about is an excellent example of that. And the decisions that are questioning some of these laws, like that Hunter Biden himself is indicted for, or in the case before the Supreme Court now, the Rahimi case, possession of a firearm while under a domestic protective order. Is there a historical analog to that from the founding period? And the answer is no. We have a Fifth Circuit decision that invalidated that law, prohibiting possession of a firearm by a person under a protective order. So we'll see where the Supreme Court goes on that. I won't make predictions, but that's what we're all looking for. What's the next step? I mean, deciding the New York case was kind of easy because there you had law-abiding citizens. And with the criminal side of this, you've got some people who are not model citizens like Mr. Rahimi. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, okay.
Now, Steve, I think you should give yourself maybe some credit, you and other scholars, for helping push this idea of the historical context around the time of the adoption of the Second Amendment. So tell us a tiny bit at least about that. I mean, you've been doing research in this area for many decades.
Well, this is one of those real conspiracies. We had a conference. I was a law student still. 1977, Don Cates had put it together, a great friend.
I remember him well.
We were
resolved. I remember you from back in the 60s, I think, even before the 70s. But go ahead. From 69, if you attended that Murray Rothbard thing in New York in 1969, well, I did. Anyway, we resolved we wanted to start writing law review articles and books on Second Amendment rights, and some of us fallen through and did that, and the courts became convinced by the scholarship that became the standard model, and the whole idea that the Second Amendment doesn't protect individual rights was put to rest. The theory was some kind of collective militia right that nobody has, and so over time that simply got unmasked, even though that was the theory that the real smart people at the cocktail parties, the American Bar Association people, they all enunciated that. They thought the American public was inaccurately thought they had a right individually to keep and bear arms. And so we've made a lot of progress, and so much progress
I think in the Second Amendment field that it's hard to keep track of now.
It's great. And listen, here at the Independent Institute, we are especially grateful for the work that you, Steve Halbrook, have done in this area. And I'd encourage our friends who want to know more, go to our website, independent.org, and you can find a lot of materials on the subject, as well as you can purchase Stephen Halbrook's books on the topic through our website. They're also available on Amazon, and we're really appreciative of all that you have done. Any final comments from either of you before we sign off?
Thank you,
Okay,
Graham.
Bill, what do you think?
I think we're living in a better age.
Thank you for the hard work for liberty, both of you gentlemen. And we'll sign off.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you so much, Chief Halbrook, Williamson, Evers, and thanks for joining us here on Independent Outlook at the Independent Institute. Take care, everybody.